Hey everyone, welcome to this RetroPie video tutorial. This video is the beginning of a multi-part series for installing RetroPie. We'll be downloading the official RetroPie base image, and over the course of the next several videos, we're going to go through all of the installation and configuration for it. Starting with the default emulation station, we'll go through the steps to get our controllers configured, as well as transfer over some ROM files and scrape them for metadata. And because the latest release of RetroPie also now includes an installation for Attract mode over in the experimental packages, future episodes will be covering how to install Attract mode as well. We'll go through setting it up with emulator configuration files, installing the media that's needed, and get it fully up and running as well. So by the end of the series, we will have installed RetroPie from scratch, got it fully configured with both front ends, and ready for some retro gaming. So let's get started. So one of the first things we need to do, of course, is download RetroPie itself. The quickest way is to go to Google and search for RetroPie, and almost always the very first link you will see the download link to go get RetroPie. And on this page, if you're using a Raspberry Pi 1 or Raspberry 0, you'll need to download this package. But for our series of videos, we're going to be using the Raspberry Pi 2/3 image, and we'll be using a Raspberry Pi 3 is what we'll be using. So you would download that file. So I've already done it. So when you download it, it comes in a .gz archive format, and on this Windows computer I've installed 7-zip as my unarchiving program. So you would just right click on there, go to 7-zip, and extract here. And when you're done, you're going to be left with this image. This is the RetroPie 4.1 release. It's a little over 2 gig in size. So this is a Windows computer, and the program that I use that a lot of people recommend is Win32 Disk Imager. With this program, you can do a couple of things. You can write an image over to an SD card, or once you've got your RetroPie all configured, you can take your SD card out, put it back in your computer, and you can make a backup copy of your SD card fully set up, so that way you'll always have it going forward. So in our case, what we're going to do for this series, we're going to be using a 64 gig SD card. So real quick, before we write this image to our SD card, one of the common questions that I see a lot is Windows, and this SD card, the 64 gig, has previously had RetroPie installed on it once. So it has already been used. So in Windows, when I insert that card back, we'll just click on Properties real fast and move this window up just a little bit. Since this already has RetroPie installed on it, Windows cannot see the full capacity of the card. It can only see a very small partition that it can read. The rest of it is a Linux partition, and Windows cannot see the rest of that partition. So even though the card is fully set up for RetroPie, Windows believes that this card is only a 56 meg size card. And we know that's not true. It is a 64 gig card. So you don't have to worry about it. Normally you do not have to reformat the card or anything like that, because Win32 Disk Imager does that for us. So we'll click on the navigation folder, and we'll go to where we extracted our image, and make sure your device is your SD card and not some external USB drive or something like that. And in this instance, we are going to write this image to our device. Later, when we do a backup, we'll be performing a read option, but in our case we'll do a write. So I'm going to go ahead and click on write, and just a little quick confirmation that says, am I truly wanting to write this to my F drive, which in my case is correct, so I'm just going to hit yes. Get this window out of the way. So this will take a couple of minutes to write that image over there, and once we're done, we will be taking it out and plugging it into our RetroPie, and we'll be performing our first boot up. So on our first boot up, one of the things that we have to do, or there's a few things that we'll need to do, but the very first thing is configure our controller. For this video series, the controller that I'm going to use is a USB gamepad. It's made by Logitech. It's an F310, It's an Xbox style gamepad that does pretty well, but it is a USB gamepad. So once we configure my controller, the next thing we need to do is expand the file system. I can't remember if the latest releases of RetroPie automatically do it for us, but we'll go ahead and walk through those steps and perform it anyway. It won't hurt if it's already expanded. It'll just, re-expand it and no harm done. But that will allow RetroPie to use the full capacity of that card. And once that's done, we'll go through and set up Wi-Fi, get it connected onto my network. After we're connected, the first thing we're going to run is update RetroPie. So we're going to update RetroPie itself to the very latest current version. And after we perform that, we'll reboot, and there's probably a few extra emulators that I'm going to go through and install. So by default, RetroPie comes with several emulators pre-installed and ready to go, but there are several that I use that aren't pre-installed. So we'll go through how to install additional emulators, and once we do that, we'll start transferring over some ROM files and look at them in the emulation station menu. Then we're going to install the scraper, the self scraper. Instead of using the built-in emulation one, we'll use the self scraper. So we'll have to install it, and then we'll run it against those sets of ROMs, and then we'll see what they look like in Emulation Station. Depending on how much time we've taken to do all of those steps, that may be the end of today's video, but future videos will cover some more in-depth things that you can do in Emulation Station, and then we'll move on to Attract mode. My write was successful, so I'm just going to go ahead and click OK and go ahead and exit. So let me exit or eject this card, go get it plugged into my RetroPie setup, and I'll be right back. You can see this is our first boot up of a Raspberry Pi, of RetroPie, and I have to configure my controller. So the controller that I'm going to use today is a USB gamepad. It's a Logitech F310, nothing fancy, just a USB gamepad. So let's go ahead and press any button. Let's just configure the gamepad real quick. Okay, so I would like to mention though that when you configure your gamepad in Emulation Station, it does two things. It configures your controller to work in Emulation Station, the menu itself, to go through the different systems, go up and down and select different games. But it also, the secondary thing that it does, it also sets up your configurations for RetroArch. So any emulator that's based on LibRetro, any of the LibRetro RetroArch emulators, they'll already be configured as soon as you put some games on there. So if you notice though, the only thing we have is RetroPie. That's the only menu option that we have. There are several installed emulators already that come pre-installed, but until you actually put a ROM file in the directory, then that menu item won't show up. So the first thing that we need to do is go into RetroPie, and we need to go down to Raspberry Pi config. We need to go in here and we need to expand our file system. And what that'll do, as mentioned, it'll let RetroPie use the full capacity of our SD card. So we'll just hit enter. So the very first option, expand file system, that's what we want to do. So we'll just go down and hit select. And then hit OK. And we'll just go over to finish. And it will ask you if you would like to reboot. So in our case, yes, we do want to reboot because we just expanded the file system. We need to let Linux know that. So let's just go ahead and reboot. Now that we've rebooted and we've expanded our file system, the next thing we need to do is get our RetroPie connected to our home network. So go into RetroPie and come all the way down to Wi-Fi. And that'll launch our Wi-Fi connection. So right now I'm not connected to anything, so we do need to connect to a Wi-Fi network. And hit the button. And there's my network. So I need to type my password. So and it'll take a second to get connected, but once it does, it'll come back to the connection screen, and it'll show you what your IP address is. And that's important for later if, like what I'll demonstrate today, is I'm going to be transferring over some ROM files via my network using an FTP program, FileZilla. So my IP address is 192.168.1.74, so I'll need to know that later. Let's go ahead and exit back out. So since we've connected to the Wi-Fi network, the next thing that we need to do is upgrade RetroPie itself. So come up to RetroPie Setup, and we do this to get the latest release of RetroPie. The official base image of RetroPie is 4.1, but they've had a few small releases since then. So we just need to make sure we're on the latest version of RetroPie. And as you can see, we're on version 4.1, and last commit date was 6 weeks ago. So what we need to do is go ahead and do an update all packages and hit OK. And it says, are you sure you want to update? Say yes. This will launch the rest of the update script that we'll go through. Now that RetroPie has fetched the latest version of itself, let's go ahead and do the update. So one of the first questions that you're going to be asked is, do you wish to update the underlying Linux operating system? And in this particular instance, I'm going to go ahead and say no, I don't want to do that. I just want to update RetroPie itself. So this will take a little while, so I will go ahead and let this run, and when this is done, we'll be back. So before we head over back to the computer to start transferring some ROM files, because in this video series I'll be using the Advanced MAME Arcade ROM set, that particular emulator isn't installed by default in the base RetroPie image. And so we do need to go install that optional emulator, and to do that you go to RetroPie Setup. So there are several emulators that are available that don't come pre-installed. So you go to Manage Packages, you come down to Manage Optional Packages, and as you can see there's lots more emulators available in RetroPie. And if you need to know or want to know what all of these other emulators are for, I highly suggest heading over to the official RetroPie wiki page, and on there you can look at all of the different systems that RetroPie supports, and it'll show you what emulators are available for that particular system. In my case, where I need to install the Advanced MAME emulator, so I'll just hit enter. And from here we need to install from binary. The difference is install from binary is it'll install a precompiled version of that emulator ready to go. And install from source will connect to the internet, download the source code for that emulator, and then your Raspberry Pi will have to compile it. So that does take a lot longer, but normally you wouldn't do that. So today we'll just hit install from binary, and then it'll connect to the internet, download that particular emulator, and then it'll return to our menu. And at that point we'll head over to the computer and start transferring some ROM files. Some of these emulators take longer to install than others, it just depends, but that's how you would install them. So if you need to install any of these additional emulators, now's a good time to do it. Also, one of the main reasons as well to do this is the folders over in the ROMs directory aren't usually pre-made for you for those emulators that aren't installed yet. So for instance, MAME Advanced, they go into the ROMs folder with a name of MAME-MAME Advanced. That particular folder isn't there for us yet until we install the emulator. Commodore 64 is another common one. The C64 folder does not exist over in the ROMs directory until you install the Vice emulator. So if you ever want to copy over ROMs from a system and you don't see that folder already there over in the ROMs directory, there's a pretty good chance that that emulator isn't installed yet. So you will need to come and manually install that particular emulator. Then your folder will show up and you can copy over your ROMs files. So for us, we'll go ahead and hit back, and I'll go ahead and install a few more of these emulators that I like to use. And let's reconvene over on the computer, and we'll transfer over some ROM files. Here we are, back on the computer. I finished up installing all of the additional emulators that I wanted on my RetroPie build. So now it's time to transfer over some games, transfer over some ROMs. And for this video series, I'm going to use the Advanced MAME arcade ROM set. There's a little over 6,000 ROMs, and that includes clones and hacked versions and everything else. So that is a full ROM set. So this is just my directory of the ROM sets. And so there's a couple of different ways, as I mentioned, to transfer ROMs on a Windows computer. And one of the ways is using Windows Explorer itself. So if you remember, we had our IP address earlier. We jotted it down, and there should be 2 slashes here. So we jotted down what our IP address was, and when you do that and you put it in your Windows Explorer, we are actually connected to our RetroPie into the folders and files that we're allowed to see. So if you double click on ROMs, and for Advanced MAME, you have to go into the MAME Advanced directory. So to copy them with Windows Explorer, what you would do is you would just bring up another Windows Explorer window, and then you could actually just drag and drop them into the MAME Advanced ROMs directory. Another way is using an FTP program, and the one I have up here is the one that I use a lot. It's FileZilla. And the way this works is you just connect to that same IP address and log in as user pi password raspberry. So on the left hand side is your local computer, and I'm in my ROMs directory, and on the right hand side is the RetroPie side, and I am in the MAME Advanced directory as well. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these files. I'm just going to right click and say upload, and there's about 15 gig, it looks like, of files, and that, like I said, that is a full ROM set, so it is going to take a little while to transfer those. So once these are all transferred, I'll go ahead and pick back up over on RetroPie. We will see them in the emulation station menu, and then we'll continue from there. Now that our transfer of our MAME ROM set is completed, we're back in RetroPie now. As you can see, we have a new menu item for MAME. That's our arcade games, and we have over 6,000 of those games that came across show up on our menu. So when you go in here, here are all of our games that we transferred over. Now right now it's just a list of those games. We haven't scraped them for their metadata to get like who made the game, the year, and that types of information, as well as to get an image, like a in-game screenshot image for those. But here are all of our games, and like I said, we did copy over the full ROM set, so we do have different versions of games in here and clones as well, so they are all in here right now, but this is all of the games that we copied over. So right now I think we're going to end this video. We're approaching about the 20-minute mark, and I want to keep most of the videos around there. So between now and the next video, go ahead and get some more ROM sets if you want of different consoles or other arcade-based systems like Final Burn Alpha. But hopefully with what you've seen in this video, you'll be able to get those other ones copied over there and get them to show up here in Emulation Station and get to some retro gaming. Future episodes that are coming up is probably the next one. We'll go through how to scrape all of these games to get the metadata and the images to go with them. And then after that, we'll probably go into a track mode, get a track mode installed, and get it configured and get media files for that so we can use for game previews, as well as the system selection menu that's available now. So anyway, between now and then, I hope you guys have had a good time with me here and this tutorial video. So hopefully you've got enough tools to work on adding more ROMs, adding more games to your builds, and we'll see you in the next video.